French President Emmanuel Macron has said that Russian President Vladimir Putin told him that Moscow would not further escalate the Ukraine crisis. Mr. Macron also said it would take time to find a diplomatic solution to the rising tensions, which represent the biggest security crisis between Russia and the West since the Cold War. His remarks on a visit to Kyiv came as the Kremlin denied reports that he and Mr. Putin struck a deal on de-escalating the crisis. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that in the current situation, Moscow and Paris can't be reaching any deals. French President Emmanuel Macron has claimed that Russian President Vladimir Putin said he would not escalate the Ukraine crisis. AP. Mr. Macron met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky amid mounting fears of a Russian invasion. Moscow has massed over 100,000 troops near Ukraine's borders, but insists it has no plans to attack. The Kremlin wants guarantees from the West that NATO will not accept Ukraine and other former Soviet nations as members, that it halt weapon deployments there and roll back its forces from Eastern Europe, demands the US and NATO reject as non-starters. At a news conference after meeting Mr. Zelensky, Mr. Macron said Mr. Putin told him during their more than 5-hour session Monday that he won't be initiating an escalation. I think it is important. According to the French president, Mr. Putin also said there won't be any Russian permanent military base or deployment in Belarus, where Russia had sent a large number of troops for war games. Mr. Peskov said withdrawing Russian troops from Belarus after the maneuvers was the plan all along. Ukraine is wary of a Russian invasion. AP. Mr. Zelensky said he would welcome concrete steps from Mr. Putin for de-escalation, adding he didn't trust words in general. Mr. Macron also sought to temper expectations. Let's not be naive, he said. Since the beginning of the crisis, France hasn't been inclined to exaggerate, but at the same time, I don't believe this crisis can be settled in a few hours, through discussions. Mr. Zelensky called his talks with Mr. Macron very fruitful. We have a common view with President Macron on threats and challenges to the security of Ukraine, of the whole of Europe, of the world in general, Mr. Zelensky said. Read more. Luxury house explosion captured on doorbell camera. Mr. Macron had fruitful talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. AP. He said France was giving €1.2 billion, $1.92 billion, in financial aid to Ukraine and helping restore infrastructure in the war-ravaged east of the country. Western leaders in recent weeks have engaged in high-level talks, and more are planned amid the backdrop of military drills in Russia and Belarus. On Tuesday, Russia's defense ministry said 6 large warships were moving from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea for exercises. Mr. Macron said he had not expected Mr. Putin to make any gestures Monday, saying his objective was to prevent an escalation and open new perspectives. That objective is met. Mr. Macron said Mr. Putin set a collective trap by initiating the exchange of documents with the US. Moscow submitted its demands to Washington in the form of draft agreements that were made public, and insisted on a written response, which was then leaked. Mr. Zelensky said he would welcome concrete steps to de-escalate from Russia. AP. In the history of diplomacy, there was never a crisis that has been settled by exchanges of letters which are to be made public afterward, he said, adding that's why he decided to go to Moscow for direct talks. Mr. Putin said after the meeting that the US and NATO ignored Moscow's demands, but signaled readiness to continue talking. He also reiterated a warning that NATO membership for Ukraine could trigger a war between Russia and the alliance should Kyiv try to retake the Crimean Peninsula, which Moscow annexed in 2014. NATO, US and European leaders reject the demands that they say challenge NATO's core principles, like shutting the door to Ukraine or other countries that might seek membership, but they have offered to discuss other Russian security concerns in Europe. US President Joe Biden has said any prospect of Ukraine entering NATO in the near term is not very likely, but he and other alliance members and NATO itself refused to rule out Ukraine's future entry. countries with the highest military expenditure in the World View Gallery. Mr. Biden met Monday with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who also will travel to Kyiv and Moscow on February 14th to 15th. They threatened Russia with grave consequences if it invaded, and Mr. Biden vowed that the Nord Stream 2 Russia to Germany gas pipeline, which has been completed but is not yet operating, will be blocked. Such a move would hurt Russia economically, but also cause energy supply problems for Germany. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, in an article in the Times of London, also urged allies to finalize heavy economic sanctions that would take effect if Russia crosses into Ukraine. He said the UK is ready to bolster NATO forces in Latvia and Estonia, as he prepared to meet the Lithuanian Prime Minister in London to show support for the Baltic nations. Mr. Johnson said he was considering dispatching RAF Typhoon fighters and Royal Navy warships to southeastern Europe. Britain said Monday it is sending 350 troops to Poland to bolster NATO's eastern flank. It already has sent anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. More than 100 US military personnel arrived in Romania ahead of a deployment of about 1,000 NATO troops expected in the country in the coming days, Romania's Defense Minister Vasil Dinku said. US officials have said that about 1,000 alliance troops will be sent from Germany to Romania, a NATO member since 2004. Romania borders Ukraine to the north. About 1,700 US soldiers from the 82nd Airborne are also going to Poland. US officials have portrayed the threat of an invasion of Ukraine as imminent, warnings Moscow has scoffed at, accusing Washington of fueling tensions. Russia and Ukraine have been locked in a bitter conflict since 2014, when Ukraine's Kremlin-friendly president was ousted, Moscow annexed Crimea, and then backed a separatist insurgency in the east of the country. The fighting between Russia-backed rebels and Ukrainian forces has killed over 14,000 people. In 2015, France and Germany helped broker a peace deal, known as the Minsk Agreements, that ended large-scale hostilities, but failed to bring a political settlement of the conflict. The Kremlin has repeatedly accused Kyiv of sabotaging the deal, and Ukrainian officials in recent weeks said that implementing it would hurt Ukraine. After meeting Mr. Macron, Mr. Putin said without elaboration that some of the French president's proposals could serve as a basis for a settlement of the separatist conflict, adding that they agreed to speak by phone after Mr. Macron's visit to Kyiv. Mr. Peskov said such a call would take place in the nearest future. Mr. Macron said both Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky confirmed they were willing to implement the Minsk agreements, the only path allowing to build peace and find a sustainable political solution. Mr. Macron also said the presidential advisors of France, Germany, Russia and Ukraine will meet Thursday in Berlin on the next steps. It will take time to get results, he said. Mr. Zelensky was mum on where Ukraine stands on implementing the Minsk agreements, and whether he assured Mr. Macron that Kyiv is committed to do so, saying only that his country views Thursday's meeting very positively, and hoped for a subsequent meeting by the four leaders. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, visiting the front line in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region, said she wanted to get an impression of what it means that we still have war in the middle of Europe.